The Beast Within didn't emerge as a typical early 80 seconds monster film. It grew out of a volatile mixture of secrecy, desperation, and a script that seemed to mutate with every revision. What began as a straightforward horror project quickly unraveled into a production plagued by abandoned concepts, erratic effects, tests, and emotional strain that left the cast visibly frayed. Each stage of filming carried its own tremor, as though the story's underlying violence seeped into the work itself. Why did a modestly funded film spiral into such disorder? And how did its creature end up haunting generations of viewers long after its release? These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about The Beast Within. Fact 1. The origins of The Beast Within trace back to a screenplay haunted by implications no one involved wanted to confront directly. Although the studio framed the film as a creature-driven horror piece, early drafts hinted at roots in a real and deeply troubling criminal case that cast a long, unspoken shadow over the story. Writers were encouraged to distance themselves from the inspiration, yet fragments of that initial darkness clung to every revision, shaping a narrative that felt morally unsettled even before filming began. Scenes shifted tone dramatically from one rewrite to the next, and actors frequently arrived on set to discover freshly altered dialogue that seemed to pull the story in a new direction. The director later admitted that he often sensed the script fighting against itself, as though two incompatible impulses, the urge to explore trauma and the need to deliver commercial horror, kept colliding beneath the surface. That tension permeated the entire production, influencing the way performers approached their roles and the atmosphere that settled over the set. Critics would eventually describe the film as disjointed, but the real source of its unease was far more human, a story trying to escape the weight of the truth that inspired it. What audiences perceived as narrative instability was, in many ways, the ghost of something the filmmakers couldn't bear to acknowledge openly. Fact 2. Finding an actor capable of embodying Michael's unraveling proved to be one of the production's most delicate challenges. Many performers who auditioned captured either the character's vulnerability or his latent ferocity, but few could convincingly occupy the fragile space between the two. The role demanded subtle shifts, fear edging into rage, innocence bleeding into something darker, often within a single breath. When Paul Clemens auditioned, he delivered a performance that felt unstable, yet strangely precise, as if he were channeling a force he didn't entirely control. His unpredictability intrigued the director, though producers worried whether someone so young could withstand the emotional and physical strain of the transformation sequences. Hours spent under prosthetics left Clemens dripping with sweat, his skin raw from adhesives that tightened unpredictably. Crew members noticed how he withdrew into himself between takes, pacing with restless energy as though something inside him refused to settle. These behaviors lent authenticity to his on-screen deterioration, blurring the boundary between acting and endurance. By the end of production, Clemens's performance had become the film's emotional anchor, offering a rawness that elevated material often constrained by budget and circumstance. The irony is that the very volatility producers feared might hinder him instead became the core of what made his portrayal unforgettable. Fact 3. The transformation sequence, now considered the film's defining moment, was born from a process that teetered constantly between innovation and complete collapse. With limited funds and a demanding script, the effects team was forced to invent solutions using materials that were never designed for such extreme manipulation. Early attempts resulted in makeup splitting open under heat, revealing gaps that ruined entire takes. Mechanical bladders meant to simulate pulsating muscles misfired unpredictably, inflating too rapidly or not at all. Adhesives reacted differently depending on humidity, causing appliances to sag, peel, or fuse in ways the team couldn't anticipate. The actor endured hours strapped into rigs that constricted his movement and made breathing difficult, adding genuine strain to the performance. What emerged on film was less a polished metamorphosis than a visceral struggle, a body fighting its own distortion. Editors pieced together fragments, some accidental, some intentionally chaotic, until the sequence took on an unsettling rhythm that felt disturbingly alive. Viewers later praised the transformation for its raw intensity, unaware of how much of its power came from effects that barely functioned as intended. What should have been a technical failure became a psychological triumph, turning fragility into terror. Fact 4. Securing usable locations became one of the production's most unpredictable battles, shaping the film in ways the crew never anticipated. The rural environment chosen for its atmospheric stillness quickly proved resistant to filmmaking, as sudden storms flooded access roads, turned fields into heavy mud, and transformed equipment transport into an exhausting ordeal. The abandoned mill, a central set piece, deteriorated visibly throughout the shoot. Wooden beams shifted under weight, dust cascaded from rafters with every footstep, and the slightest vibration caused debris to fall unpredictably. The crew adapted constantly, reinforcing unstable structures with whatever materials were available, often racing daylight as weather forced delays. Humidity complicated every department's work. Prosthetics softened, lights flickered, and camera lenses fogged at the worst moments. Even local wildlife made its presence felt, intruding into scenes with uncanny timing that left actors breaking character in discomfort. Despite these obstacles, the studio insisted the authenticity of the environment outweighed the challenges, pushing the team to persevere. Ironically, the unavoidable imperfections, drifting shadows, uneven footing, and the pervasive sense of decay became some of the film's strongest visual assets. What looked like deliberate production design was, in truth, the land asserting itself on the narrative. The location did not merely host the story, it shaped its mood with a stubborn, haunting persistence. Fact 5. Behind the camera, creative tension simmered as the director and studio pursued visions of the film that grew increasingly incompatible. The director sought a bleak, psychological portrait of a young man, unraveling beneath forces both inherited and imposed, while executives pushed for a more conventional creature spectacle that could be marketed easily. Script revisions arrived with unsettling regularity, adding violence or simplifying character motives in attempts to align the movie with mainstream expectations. These changes disrupted the emotional through line the director was building, leaving performers uncertain whether they were playing tragedy, suspense, or pure horror. Crew members recounted overhearing late-night discussions in which the director fought to preserve thematic nuance, arguing that ambiguity made the story more unsettling than explicit explanations ever could. Editors later inherited scenes shot under competing directions, each capturing a different emotional register, making the material feel like fragments of multiple films. What emerged from this conflict was a tone that critics initially saw as confused, but which later audiences found hypnotic. The film's refusal to settle into a single identity became its accidental strength. The tension between artistic intention and commercial pressure didn't fracture the movie, it defined it. Fact 6. The creation of the film's creature design unfolded through a series of experiments marked by conflicting philosophies and relentless material failure. Some designers pushed for a look that preserved faint echoes of Michael's humanity, believing the transformation should evoke sorrow as much as terror. Others argued for a more grotesque metamorphosis, emphasizing torn flesh, bulging structures, and anatomical distortion to reflect the violence of an identity collapsing inward. These competing visions produced prototypes that varied wildly in tone and texture, from subtle, almost mournful contours to aggressive, monstrous silhouettes. Heat warped early sculpts, adhesives reacted unpredictably, and several mechanical rigs malfunctioned the moment they were tested under studio lights. The actor endured repeated fittings that left his skin irritated and his patience frayed. Yet his discomfort inadvertently contributed to the creature's trembling, uneven movements. After weeks of trial and error, the final design emerged not through consensus, but through survival. What remained was a form that hovered unsettlingly between human and inhuman, embodying the story's central contradiction. Critics later debated whether the creature's awkward proportions were artistic intent or technical limitation. The truth lies somewhere in the middle. The monster reflected the production's fractured process, becoming a mirror of the film's own unstable identity. Fact 7. The film's most unsettling sonic element, the creature's tortured vocal signature, emerged from a recording process that pushed everyone involved far beyond ordinary sound design. Early attempts relied on splicing animal roars with mechanical drones, but the results felt staged, lacking the anguished humanity that the transformation demanded. Sound technicians began searching for something more intimate, a noise that carried the sensation of a mind trapped inside a body betraying itself. They invited actors and crew into the studio, asking them to experiment with strained exhalations, clipped breaths, and guttural vibrations coaxed from the deepest parts of the throat. Several participants described feeling physically shaken afterward, as though the contortions had stirred something primal, layered with low-frequency rumble and faint metallic resonance. These raw recordings fused into a sound neither fully human nor entirely monstrous. When paired with the transformation footage, the effect became disturbingly visceral. The creature's cry didn't merely accompany the scene, it pierced it, creating an emotional rupture that lingered long after playback stopped. Even the director admitted feeling uneasy the first time the sound synchronized perfectly with the visual distortions, noting that it seemed less like a special effect and more like a confession. Editors debated softening the mix. Concerned audiences might react too strongly, but the final decision preserved the unfiltered intensity. What viewers experience today as an iconic horror moment wasn't engineered through complex technology. It emerged from human voices pushed so close to breaking that they became something unrecognizable, capturing the terror of transformation in its most vulnerable form. Fact 8. When all filming concluded, the responsibility of shaping the beast within into a coherent narrative fell onto an editing team confronted with footage that rarely synchronized in tone, rhythm, or emotional logic. Scenes captured under creative disagreements shifted abruptly between psychological subtlety and explosive horror, leaving editors with material that felt like fragments of entirely different films. Continuity issues compounded the challenge. Lighting varied across takes, performances evolved unpredictably, and reshoots introduced conflicting interpretations of key moments. Unable to rely on clean narrative flow, the editors began constructing an emotional logic instead, piecing together sequences based on how tension rose and receded rather than how plot threaded together. This approach gradually transformed the film into a dreamlike experience, its disjointed edges forming an eerie cadence that held viewers even when the story wandered. Sound design became a crucial adhesive, smoothing over visual discrepancies and shaping transitions that the footage alone could not support. Over time, the editing room grew to resemble a laboratory, with each experiment revealing new possibilities within the film's instability. Critics initially condemned the final cut as unfocused, unaware that coherence had been impossible from the start. Yet the very qualities once perceived as flaws, the drifting tone, the fragmented pacing, the impression of constant unease, eventually became hallmarks of the film's enduring appeal. The editors didn't merely assemble a movie, they distilled its chaos into a form that felt hauntingly deliberate. Fact 9. Marketing The Beast Within proved nearly as turbulent as making it, as the studio struggled to translate the film's hybrid identity into a message that would resonate with audiences. Early posters highlighted grotesque imagery, hoping shock alone would draw horror fans, but test groups reported fascination rather than fear, sensing depths the artwork failed to convey. Trailers emphasized transformation scenes without context, presenting the film as a straightforward creature feature, even though its emotional center rested on themes of inherited violence and psychological unraveling. Publicists debated endlessly over how much of the story to reveal, torn between embracing ambiguity and offering clarity to avoid confusing audiences. The film's refusal to conform to genre expectations complicated every strategy. Its tone was too mournful for exploitation marketing, yet its brutality too explicit for a purely atmospheric campaign. When the release finally approached, the studio settled for a vague, tension-heavy promotion that hinted at terror without defining it. This ambiguity frustrated some viewers, who entered theaters expecting a conventional monster story, yet intrigued others who sensed the marketing concealed more than it revealed. Over time, this mismatch between promise and experience became part of the film's mythology. The marketing failed to define the beast within because the film itself resisted definition, living in the liminal space between tragedy and horror. Ironically, its greatest promotional obstacle became the very source of its lasting fascination. Fact 10. The production's growing unease reached its peak inside the abandoned mill, a location chosen for its haunting aesthetic, but remembered for the strange phenomena the crew quietly whispered about. At first, the disturbances were easy to dismiss, lights flickering without explanation, microphones capturing faint hums during supposedly silent stretches, and equipment malfunctioning despite repeated checks. But as the weeks passed, these incidents accumulated into patterns too consistent to ignore. Camera operators described feeling sudden temperature drops while framing shots, as if a draft passed through walls that had no openings. Some crew members refused to work alone in certain corners of the building, insisting the shadows shifted even when the air was still. Locals had warned them that the mill carried an unsettling history, stories of disappearances, fires, and unexplainable accidents that were rarely documented but widely believed. Whether these tales influenced perception or reflected genuine phenomena, the result was the same. A tension seeped into every performance, amplifying the film's sense of dread. Actors noted that emotional scenes felt heavier, as though the environment absorbed and reflected their anxieties. The director encouraged everyone to focus, attributing the unease to exhaustion, yet privately he admitted the building seemed to press inward, altering the energy of the set. What viewers later praised as atmospheric realism was, in fact, a convergence of fear, fatigue, and a location that seemed intent on imprinting itself onto the film. The mill didn't just serve as a backdrop, it became a silent, uncredited force shaping the movie's tone. Fact 11. As filming pushed deeper into emotionally demanding territory, the cast began experiencing the psychological weight of portraying characters caught in a cycle of violence and transformation. The prosthetics required for the role placed actors under extreme physical strain, compressing their features until speaking or breathing felt constricted. Paul Clemens endured the most intense demands, spending hours encased in layers of latex that tightened gradually as they warmed under the lights. He later described the sensation as being trapped behind a mask that slowly fused to his skin. Between takes, he often isolated himself, pacing in quiet corners while his body reacted to the lingering pressure of the appliances. Other actors reported waking from vivid dreams filled with distorted imagery, a reflection of spending long days immersed in a world defined by bodily distortion. Attempts by the crew to lighten the atmosphere provided only brief relief before the story's darker undertones reclaimed the set. Even technicians not appearing on camera admitted to carrying home an inexplicable heaviness at the end of each day, as though the film's emotional landscape had embedded itself into their thoughts. Critics later praised the authenticity of the performances, noting the palpable sense of unraveling that permeated the screen. What those critics didn't realize was that the performances were shaped not only by acting skill, but by the cumulative psychological pressure of inhabiting a narrative built around transformation and loss of control. Fact 12. The special effects team found themselves trapped in an ongoing philosophical conflict about the creature's identity, a debate that shaped every step of the design process. Some argued that traces of Michael's humanity needed to remain visible, believing the transformation should evoke sorrow rather than pure terror. Others insisted the creature must embody total rupture, a form defined by jagged anatomy, broken symmetry, and the grotesque logic of a body turning against itself. These opposing visions spawned prototype after prototype, each embodying a different emotional interpretation of the curse central to the story. Heat warped early sculpts beyond recognition, while adhesives meant to secure prosthetics reacted unpredictably, causing appliances to bubble or separate in unnerving ways. Mechanical elements intended to simulate muscle contractions frequently jammed, creating accidental movements that were unsettling precisely because they defied design. The actor endured repeated fittings that left him exhausted, yet his discomfort added a trembling urgency to the creature's later on-screen movements. When the final design emerged, it felt less like a consensus and more like the inevitable survivor of countless abandoned concepts. Viewers debated whether its uneven proportions were artistic brilliance or a consequence of technical limitations. What remains clear is that the creature embodied the central tension of the film, a being caught between tragedy and monstrosity, shaped as much by conflict as by intent. Fact 13. The creation of the creature's signature cry became one of the production's most unsettling undertakings, blurring the line between performance and genuine distress. Early sound tests failed to capture the emotional violence of Michael's transformation. Animal recordings sounded too familiar, and synthetic distortions felt hollow. The team realized they needed something rooted in the human voice, a sound that conveyed fear, resistance, and surrender simultaneously. They invited volunteers into dim recording booths and asked them to push their vocal cords into unnatural territories. Strained inhalations, ragged exhalations, and guttural vibrations born from tension rather than aggression. Many emerged visibly shaken, describing sensations that lingered long after the microphone went silent. Technicians layered these fragments with subtle low-frequency pulses and metallic undertones, creating a sonic texture that felt disturbingly organic. When paired with the footage, the cry didn't simply highlight the transformation, it deepened it, making the metamorphosis seem like an internal collapse broadcast through sound. Even the director hesitated before approving the final mix, noting its uncanny ability to provoke discomfort in listeners who didn't yet know its context. Audiences later praised the film for its immersive horror, unaware that the most haunting sound came not from elaborate machinery, but from human voices pressed to the brink of breaking. The creature's scream wasn't invented, it was extracted. Fact 14. While the film's makeup and effects often garner the most attention, the wardrobe department quietly shouldered one of the production's most demanding challenges: designing costumes that could withstand the physical extremes of transformation. Clothing meant to tear at predetermined seams frequently ripped unpredictably, leaving fragments that compromised continuity from one shot to the next. Humidity caused fabrics to cling or sag in inconsistent ways, and adhesives from prosthetics stained garments beyond repair. To maintain visual coherence, the wardrobe team created multiple versions of each outfit, each corresponding to a different phase of Michael's bodily collapse. They worked at a frantic pace, repairing tears, reinforcing seams, and distressing fabric to match footage often shot days apart. These efforts became even more complicated when reshoots altered the sequence of the transformation, requiring the team to recreate precise levels of decay with only limited reference material. Actors recalled feeling the tension in their clothing, noting how the constriction mirrored their characters' psychological deterioration. What audiences interpreted as intentional symbolism, a wardrobe unraveling in tandem with identity, was often the result of the crew's desperate attempts to keep pace with unpredictable effects. The clothing didn't merely support the transformation, it reflected the production's constant battle against entropy. Fact 15. Filming the emotional apex of The Beast Within required the cinematography team to balance technical fragility with the psychological turmoil at the story's core. The director envisioned a sequence that communicated collapse through shifting light and constricting visual space, yet the equipment available was far from ideal. Dolly tracks warped on uneven floors, handheld rigs grew unstable in cramped rooms, and moisture from the environment seeped into electrical components, threatening shutdowns at critical moments. Despite these constraints, the crew pursued compositions that emphasized claustrophobia and disorientation, framing Michael through fractured reflections and encroaching shadows. Actors, responding to the unstable energy on set, delivered performances marked by trembling subtlety and flashes of raw despair. In one take, a flickering light inadvertently synchronized with the actor's breathing, creating a rhythmic pulse that heightened the scene's emotional charge. Rather than discard the moment, the director embraced it, recognizing the power of an accident that captured the story's unraveling more effectively than meticulous planning ever could. When the sequence was assembled, critics noted its intensity without realizing how much of it emerged from improvisation born of necessity. The climax's power lay not in precision, but in vulnerability of equipment, of performers, and of a film on the edge of losing control. Fact 16. When The Beast Within reached censorship boards, the reaction was far more severe than the producers had anticipated. What troubled regulators was not merely the explicit violence, but the film's suggestion that monstrosity could be inherited through a crime rooted in human cruelty rather than supernatural myth. Boards across multiple regions argued that the story blurred lines between victimhood and transformation in ways audiences might find distressingly ambiguous. Scenes depicting bodily rupture were flagged repeatedly, even after editors trimmed frames with near-surgical precision. Yet the emotional brutality embedded in the narrative persisted, making even softened cuts feel too intense for certain classifications. Negotiations dragged on for weeks, with some territories requesting changes so drastic they threatened to dismantle the film's internal logic. Others declined certification altogether, citing thematic instability and imagery incompatible with public exhibition. The controversy mystified the filmmakers, who believed they were delivering a creature feature rather than provoking philosophical debates about trauma and identity. Ironically, the stricter the censors became, the more intrigue the film generated among horror audiences who assumed a work provoking such concern must be uniquely transgressive. Instead of suppressing interest, the regulatory pushback elevated the film's profile, transforming it into an object of curiosity. The Beast Within became known not for the scenes removed, but for the ones viewers imagined proof that censorship often amplifies precisely what it seeks to diminish. Fact 17. Test screenings revealed a divide so sharp that studio executives questioned whether the film could appeal to any single audience. Some viewers responded deeply to Michael's deterioration, interpreting the narrative as a tragic allegory for inherited trauma. Others reacted with uneasy laughter during transformation scenes, unsure whether the raw analog effects were meant to horrify or shock in a theatrical sense. The tonal shifts created by competing creative impulses left audiences searching for emotional footing, only to find themselves dropped repeatedly into new atmospheres. Studio representatives grew increasingly anxious as feedback cards oscillated between praise for the film's intensity and confusion about its intent. The director defended the instability, asserting that horror emerges most powerfully from uncertainty rather than coherence. But audiences accustomed to more polished genre conventions struggled to reconcile the film's blend of grief, mutation, and Southern Gothic influence. Over time, however, the very qualities that unsettled initial viewers became points of fascination for those revisiting the film. Critics began reassessing the structure, suggesting its uneven rhythms mirrored the protagonist's psychological fragmentation. What once seemed like narrative inconsistency evolved into an invitation to experience horror as emotional disorientation. The Beast Within didn't fail to choose a tone, it refused to be limited by one. Fact 18. Following a modest theatrical release, The Beast Within found unexpected longevity in the world of video rentals, where horror fans often relied more on instinct and box art than critical reviews. The film's cover, depicting a face torn between human anguish and monstrous emergence, captured attention with a boldness that mainstream posters avoided. Those who rented it expecting a conventional creature narrative were instead met with a film steeped in folklore, psychological tension, and bodily upheaval. Word spread through rental shops, fan newsletters, and convention circles, where enthusiasts praised its willingness to embrace awkwardness and emotional extremity. Its imperfections became virtues to viewers who sought horror unshaped by studio gloss. Many noted that the film's unpredictability kept it alive in memory long after more polished works faded. The tonal fractures that troubled early audiences resonated with later fans who interpreted them as expressions of internal conflict rather than mistakes. As discussions grew, the film transformed into a cult object, an example of horror that thrived precisely because it defied categorization. Instead of following genre expectations, it carved its own crooked path, attracting those who gravitated toward stories that felt dangerous, unstable, and strangely personal. What began as a video store curiosity became a testament to how unconventional films survive, not by fitting in, but by refusing to. Fact 19. The transformation sequence in The Beast Within has continued to resonate not because of flawless craftsmanship, but because its imperfections evoke something disturbingly real. Unlike the precision of other iconic metamorphosis scenes from the era, this one unfolds with an unpredictability that feels almost spontaneous, as though the body on screen is reacting to forces neither designed nor controlled. The prosthetics pulse unevenly, skin appears to ripple without a clear pattern, and the actors' strained expressions betray genuine discomfort beneath the latex. Technicians recalled how rigs malfunctioned during key takes, creating distortions that had never been planned yet appeared unsettlingly organic once filmed. These mistakes lent the transformation an emotional rawness that no amount of budget or polish could replicate. Editors, confronted with footage that seemed alive in its instability, leaned into the chaos rather than smoothing it out, crafting a sequence that communicates internal rupture more than external showmanship. Viewers, rather than focusing on the creature's final form, found themselves captivated by the agonizing process of becoming an evolution marked by resistance, panic, and involuntary surrender. Over time, scholars have argued that the scene's power lies precisely in its unpredictability. It mirrors the horror of losing control over one's own body. In a genre often defined by spectacle, the film achieved something far rarer. It made transformation feel like trauma rather than entertainment, a distinction that secured its place in horror history not through perfection, but through the unsettling honesty of its flaws. Fact 20. The Beast Within occupies an unusual space within horror cinema, a film simultaneously compared to genre landmarks and yet rarely granted the same prestige. What sets it apart is not simply its modest resources, but its refusal to commit to a singular narrative identity. Instead of offering a creature built upon clear mythology or scientific explanation, the story presents a being shaped by violence, folklore, and emotional decay, its origins deliberately tangled rather than clarified. This ambiguity unsettled early audiences who sought predictable arcs, but for later viewers, it became one of the film's most compelling traits. Michael's transformation is never framed as destiny or punishment. It is a convergence of forces that defy categorization, leaving the creature's purpose open to interpretation. Critics revisiting the film decades later observed that its fractured tone mirrors the protagonist's own internal collapse, creating a narrative that feels unstable by design, even if born from conflict. The film seems to inhabit the borderland between tragedy and monster tale, refusing to let either dominate. This resistance to definition invited debate among horror scholars who recognize the story as a study in liminality, a portrayal of metamorphosis that reveals more about the human psyche than supernatural lore. In the end, the film's legacy rests not on clarity, but on its persistent elusiveness. It is remembered because it cannot be neatly understood, a reminder that some monsters linger precisely because they refuse to explain themselves. Bonus fact: long after production wrapped, a persistent rumor emerged about a mysterious reel that vanished before the film reached its final cut, a sequence so unsettling that even those who witnessed it struggled to articulate what made it feel different from every other transformation attempt. Crew members described it not as a finished effect, but as a test shot captured during a late-night session when exhaustion blurred judgment. The scene reportedly depicted Michael caught at an intermediate phase, his features flickering between forms under stuttering lights that had begun malfunctioning earlier that day. The prosthetics used were experimental, layered with translucent membranes designed to pulse in response to subtle mechanical triggers. But something malfunctioned. Instead of expanding rhythmically, the layers rippled irregularly, creating the illusion of flesh trying and failing to detach from bone. The actor's breathing, partially muffled beneath the appliances, filled the recording with a suffocating tension that made even seasoned technicians uneasy. When the footage reached the editing room, the response was immediate discomfort. It lacked theatricality, offering no cathartic release or dramatic crescendo. Instead, it felt intimate in the wrong way, as though the camera had stumbled upon a private moment of suffering rather than a staged metamorphosis. Editors argued that including it would disrupt the film's emotional balance, shifting the horror from spectacle to something disturbingly introspective. The director agreed, ordering the fragment removed. What happened next is unclear. Some say the reel was destroyed to prevent accidental inclusion, while others insist it was archived quietly, forgotten somewhere in a mislabeled canister. Whether the footage still exists remains unknown, but its absence has fueled speculation for decades. For many fans, the idea of the lost sequence has become more haunting than anything preserved on screen, a reminder that the most disturbing transformations are often the ones left unseen. Tell us which part of this story lingered with you the longest, and whether you view The Beast Within as an overlooked tragedy or a fractured horror tale that found its strength through imperfection. The film's uneasy legacy continues to spark debate, and your perspective adds another layer to its evolving mythology. If there are other forgotten productions, hidden scandals, or misunderstood performances you want us to explore, share your suggestions in the comments. Until then, thank you for watching, and keep looking closer at the stories that refuse to settle into simple explanations.